It happened on a Tuesday evening. Just after 6 o'clock. I remember the time. Because I had only recently sat down in my living room with a cup of coffee. When I heard my son's car pull into the driveway. There was nothing unusual about that. He stopped by often. Sometimes he needed help with something. Sometimes he just wanted to talk. Sometimes he would stay for dinner. When I heard the door close outside, I expected an ordinary visit. The same kind we had shared dozens of times before. When he walked into the house, though, something felt different. I could not explain it immediately. He was not angry. He was not upset. In fact, he looked strangely calm. The kind of calm people have when they have already made up their minds about something. Before the conversation even begins, he sat down across from me and barely exchanged any small talk. No questions about how I was doing. No comments about the weather. No mention of work or family. After less than a minute, he looked directly at me and said something that did not make sense. "Dad, you need to start making arrangements. You have 30 days to leave the house." At first, I honestly thought I had heard him wrong. I stared at him for several seconds, waiting for the rest of the sentence. Some kind of explanation. Some clarification. That would make those words fit into reality. But nothing came. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "The house," he said. "You need to move out within 30 days. He said it the same way a person might remind someone about a doctor's appointment. Calm. Direct. Almost rehearsed. I laughed at first. Not because it was funny, but because my brain refused to process it any other way. "This is my house." "I know," he replied. Those 3 words bothered me more than anything else. "I know." Not, "There has been a misunderstanding." Not, "Let me explain." Just, "I know." I looked around the room. Without even realizing I was doing it. The photographs on the shelves were still there. The old clock on the wall was still ticking. Everything around me was exactly the same as it had been an hour earlier. Yet somehow, my son was sitting across from me, acting as if a decision had already been made. About the future of the home I had lived in for over 30 years. The conversation did not last much longer. Every question I asked seemed to hit a wall. Why? It is complicated. Who decided this? We need to talk about that later. What exactly is happening? We will get into it. The answers were not answers at all. Then he stood up, said we would talk again soon, and left. Just like that. No real explanation. No argument. No discussion. Only a deadline. For a long time after he drove away, I sat alone in the living room, trying to understand what had just happened. The more I replayed the conversation, the less sense it made. If this had been a sudden decision, he would not have sounded so certain. If it had been an emotional reaction, there would have been an argument. Instead, it felt like he was informing me about something that had already been planned. And that was when I remembered something I had not thought about in months. About 3 months earlier, my son had come over on a Sunday afternoon. At the time, the conversation seemed completely ordinary. We were sitting at the kitchen table, when he casually asked where I kept the paperwork for the house. Not one document. All of it. The deed. The property records. The insurance information. The tax documents. Everything. I remember asking him why he needed to know. He smiled and said he was just trying to help me get organized. He said that if anything ever happened to me, it would make things easier for the family. If important documents were easy to find. At the time, the explanation sounded reasonable. Responsible, even. So I showed him. I remember walking him into my office and pointing to the filing cabinet, where I kept everything. I did not think twice about it. But sitting there alone, that Tuesday night, I suddenly realized something that made my stomach tighten. That afternoon had not been casual. At least not for him. Because now, I could not stop asking myself a question that had not existed until that moment. Why had my son been so interested in those documents? Months before he told me I had 30 days to leave my own house. That sentence from my wife kept echoing in my mind, in a way I could not control. At the time, I had never questioned it. It had sounded like one of those practical comments people make when thinking about the future. About paperwork. About keeping things simple for the family. But now, after everything my son had said, it did not feel neutral anymore. It felt like something I had misunderstood for a very long time. Without realizing it, I started going back through old memories. Not because I wanted to, but because I could not stop myself. I kept asking the same question over and over again. When exactly did this start? Not the conversation about me leaving, but the shift itself. Because now, I was no longer thinking in terms of a single decision. I was thinking in terms of a process. Something that had been unfolding long before I was aware of it. And then I remembered something I had almost forgotten. About a year before that Tuesday evening, there had been a conversation with my son that I had not given much importance to at the time. He had come over late one afternoon and mentioned, almost casually, that property was becoming complicated these days. Especially when it came to older homes that had been in families for a long time. I remember nodding. Not really engaging with it. Because it sounded like general talk. The kind of thing people say, without any specific meaning behind it. But now, I was no longer able to hear it the same way. Because that conversation was followed by others. Small ones. Separated by weeks or months. Each one touching a different part of the same subject. Without ever fully addressing it. Taxes. Maintenance. Value. Ownership. Legal paperwork. Each topic appeared independently. But now they no longer felt independent. They felt connected. In a way I had never noticed while I was inside them. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable it became. To accept that I had treated all of it as normal. I had not ignored warning signs. There had never been anything obvious enough to call a warning. That was what made it difficult to understand now. Nothing had ever crossed a clear boundary. Nothing had ever forced confrontation. Everything had stayed just inside the limits of what could be explained away as ordinary conversation between a father and a son. But when I looked at it all together, the picture had changed completely. It no longer looked like casual involvement. It looked like preparation. Not sudden preparation. Not something triggered by emotion or conflict. But something that had been built slowly over time. In layers I had never been aware of. That realization made me go back to the filing cabinet again. I do not know what I expected to find differently the second time. But I needed to look again. I sat on the floor of my office and went through everything more carefully than before. Checking each folder, each document, each detail I had previously assumed was untouched. And this time, I noticed something I had missed before. Because I had not been looking for it. A copy of a document I did not remember printing. Not missing. Not stolen. Just placed in a way that did not belong in my system. It was a simple copy of the property deed. But it had handwritten notes in the margin. Dates. Figures. Small calculations. Not mine. I knew my own handwriting too well to confuse it with anything else. It was someone else's handwriting. Written directly on something that had always been considered part of my personal records. And that was the moment something shifted in me that I cannot fully describe even now. Because up until that point, I had still been trying to fit everything into a version of reality where nothing truly intentional had happened. Where my son had simply been preparing. Or helping. Or thinking ahead in a general sense. But handwritten notes on my property documents did not belong to any of those explanations. And once I accepted that, even partially, the question changed again. It was no longer just, why is this happening? It became, how long has this already been in motion? Without me knowing. Those handwritten notes changed the entire feeling of the situation for me. Until that moment, I could still convince myself that I was misunderstanding things. That I was filling gaps with assumptions because I was stressed and confused. But ink on a legal document does not leave much room for interpretation. Someone had been actively working with my paperwork. And not just once. But in a way that suggested planning. I spent the next morning trying to figure out where that copy could have come from. I checked the printer history. Even though I was not sure what I expected to find. I went through drawers. Folders. Anything that could explain how a second version of a legal document had ended up inside my system without my awareness. Nothing made sense in isolation. But the feeling that something had been handled without my knowledge only became stronger the more I looked. That afternoon, I decided to go somewhere I had never considered visiting before. The office of the solicitor who had originally handled the property years ago. I told myself I was just clarifying a few details. Nothing more. Something simple. Something routine. But as I was driving there, I already knew this was not routine anymore. The solicitor remembered me immediately. That in itself was not surprising. What surprised me was how quickly the conversation shifted once I mentioned my son. At first, He asked general questions. The kind you would expect. But then I noticed a change in his tone. A slight hesitation. As if he was deciding how much to say. And how much to keep to himself. He told me something that made me stop listening properly for a moment. My son had contacted his office months earlier. Not once. Multiple times. He had asked questions about ownership structure. About transfer possibilities. About long-term arrangements. In case of family planning changes. Those were the exact words the solicitor used. Family planning changes. I remember repeating it back to him. Asking what that meant in practical terms. He did not give a direct answer at first. He just said it was a broad phrase. Often used when someone is preparing for a shift in ownership or control. Usually within a family context. I left that office with more clarity. But also with something heavier. Because now I had confirmation. That this was not just my son asking questions casually over time. He had been speaking to professionals. He had been asking structured questions. He had been exploring actual procedures. And the most unsettling part was not that he had done it, but that he had done it without ever involving me in any of those conversations. On the drive back home, I kept thinking about the timeline. 3 months ago. He asked about documents. Weeks later. He borrowed the ladder. Somewhere in between. He had been contacting a solicitor. And recently. He had stood in my living room. And told me I had 30 days to leave. The sequence no longer felt random. It felt connected. But there was still one thing missing. One part of the picture that did not yet make sense. Because even if he had been preparing something, even if he had been gathering information and speaking to lawyers, none of that explained the certainty in his voice that night. He had not sounded like someone building toward a decision. He had sounded like someone delivering the final stage of a decision that was already complete. And that raised a question I could not ignore anymore. If my son had been planning this for months, then who else had been part of it? Long before I was ever aware. When I got home, I went straight back to the garage. This time, I wasn't looking through things randomly. I already knew there had to be a document trail, something more concrete than memories or conversations. I started going through the storage boxes one by one. Not because I expected something new. But because I needed to confirm what I already suspected was becoming real. It didn't take long before I found another set of papers I had never seen before. They were inside a thin folder, tucked behind older tax records. At first, I thought they were duplicates. Misplaced copies. But as soon as I opened them, I knew they weren't. Not copies of anything I had ever handled. Official property-related documents. And at the top of each page, a header indicating a formal valuation process carried out by an external firm. The date caught my attention immediately. Recent. Much more recent than anything connected to routine maintenance or long-term planning. And the name listed as the requesting party was not mine. Not the solicitor I had used either. It was my son. There was no ambiguity in the document. He had initiated a professional valuation of the house, including market assessment, structural evaluation, and estimated sale potential under different transfer scenarios. Not a casual inquiry. Not informational. Procedural. Someone had treated the house not as a home, but as an asset being prepared for transition. What made it harder to process wasn't just that it existed, but the timeline it revealed. This valuation had been requested months before he ever told me I needed to leave. Which meant the decision didn't start with that conversation. That conversation was only where it became visible to me. I sat there for a long time, trying to separate what I was reading from what I thought I already knew. Because if I accepted this at face value, then what had happened was no longer informal or emotional. It was organized. Legal input. Financial assessment. Property documentation. Gathered in advance. And then arranged into a direction. The hardest part was realizing how many steps had already taken place without me noticing. The questions about documents. The interest in paperwork. The conversations about property value. The access to the house when I wasn't there. None of them mattered alone, but together. They formed a chain I never saw while I was inside it. And now I could see where that chain was going. Because a valuation like this doesn't exist without purpose. It exists because someone is preparing for a transfer of ownership, or a sale, or a restructuring of control over the property. And in every version of that process, the owner is usually aware. I wasn't. That realization changed everything that came before it. The conversation in my living room was no longer the beginning. It was just the moment the process stopped being hidden. And then one detail kept coming back to me. Again and again. The valuation didn't just estimate value. It included scenarios. Different outcomes depending on how ownership would be transferred. And in one of those scenarios, there was a clear assumption that the property would leave my control entirely within a short time frame. That time frame matched almost exactly what my son had said. 30 days. Which meant the number wasn't random. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't negotiable. It matched a plan that had already been calculated somewhere else. And if that was true, then the only thing I still didn't understand wasn't what was happening. It was why none of it had ever included me, until the very end. The next morning, I went back to the solicitor's office. But this time, I didn't ask general questions. I brought the documents with me. I placed them on his desk, and I asked him to explain something I could no longer ignore. I asked him directly why my son would request a full valuation, a structured assessment, and legal guidance for property transfer scenarios, without ever informing me. There was a pause before he answered. Not the kind of pause that comes from confusion, but the kind that comes from deciding how much truth to release at once. Eventually, he spoke. And what he said changed the way I understood the entire sequence of events. He told me my son had not initiated this process alone, at least not in the way I had been imagining. The first formal inquiry had actually come from a financial restructuring consultation, linked to debt management and long-term estate planning, initiated under advice given months earlier. At first, I didn't understand what that meant. So he explained further. My son had been under financial pressure for a long time. More than I had been aware of. Not sudden debt, not a single crisis, but a slow accumulation of obligations that had reached a point where something had to give. And at that stage, property within the family had become part of the legal discussions. Part of potential solutions. In that context, my house was no longer just a home. It was the only significant asset capable of resolving multiple financial exposures. That was the part one hadn't seen. Or rather, the part one had never been shown. Because what I understood then, was that this wasn't a single decision made in isolation. The valuation, the document requests, the legal consultations, even the timeline I had been given. They were all part of a structured process that had been building quietly for months. My son wasn't improvising when he told me I had 30 days. He was repeating a time frame that had already been established in professional discussions I was never part of. And that realization didn't make it easier. If anything, it made it worse. Because it removed the last remaining illusion I had been holding on to. That this had been sudden. That it had been emotional. That it had started in my living room. It hadn't. It had started long before that. In conversations I was never invited into. With people I never met. About decisions I never knew were being considered. When I left the office, I didn't feel anger first. I felt something heavier than anger. Because now I understood something I hadn't been able to see before. My son hadn't simply decided to push me out of my home. He had been placed into a situation where, from his perspective, there may not have been another option left that he could see. But even that explanation didn't settle anything. Because one question still remained. And it was the only one that mattered now. If this really was about financial pressure, and structured planning, why was I never told the truth while there was still time to understand it, and respond? Why was the first moment I learned any of this not a conversation, but a deadline?